guys, this is chapter 13, key issue 1. I know I kept warning you that these were going to be long. This one's not going to be that long. We're talking about CBDs, which are central business districts, and just a little bit of introduction of like the history of cities and some of the hearths for like the first like big cities. So, first off, we should talk about like what do we mean when we say urban? What do we mean when we say urbanism? Urban is the built up non-rural area and its population. So like the buildings, the people who are in the buildings, and it also includes like the appendages of that city or urban area. So like the little suburbs that are connected to that urban area. Okay. The city is the conglomeration of people and buildings clustered together as like the center of politics, cultural, and economics. So like the urban area of Sparks would include Spanish Springs, but the city itself would we would consider probably like downtown Sparks or downtown Reno would be more like the city, if that makes sense. Okay, so we use them interchangeably, urban and city, but the scale of the urban area is typically bigger than the city. So that's kind of the difference. Okay. So I have this in here because it's going to be kind of important just as we go through the rest of chapter 13 to understand the difference between a basic and a non-basic industry, since cities are often like the centers of where our industries are, right? So industries that sell their products or services to consumers outside of the settlement. So like if we made a product in Reno that was consumed by people all over the country, that would be a basic industry, okay? So like steel in Pittsburgh, it's not just people in Pittsburgh that use Pittsburgh steel, it's shipped all over the world, right? Lots of cars used to be made in Detroit. I think some of their auto industry is coming back. But those are sold all over the country and all over the world as well. Technology in Silicon Valley does not just stay in Silicon Valley, right? It goes like other places. Non-basic industries are the opposite. So those are the things that like only the people in that city are going to use, right? So like getting your hair done, typically you're going to go somewhere in town, right? Grocery store somewhere in town, and those aren't serving anybody else outside of the city, okay? Even if there's people visiting, when they come in, they're considered part of the city, if that makes sense, okay? Construction companies do projects for that city, right? The roads that are built in Reno are used by people who live in Reno. Does that make sense? Non-basic versus basic. Okay, so cities are pretty much, once we get past hunting and gathering, we start to domesticate animals and grow our own crops, cities start to formulate pretty much right away once that happens, okay? So the purpose for cities originally, and a lot of these are still the same thing, it's where the head of government was, right? So if you had a civilization who had a government, that was in the city. Centers for religion were often in the city, economic marketplaces and places where people would exchange goods, that would be in the city, and then also educational centers. Although not everybody was educated in ancient times, people who did want to receive an education would probably want to flock towards a city. So Athens, Rome, those would be examples of ancient cities. I always forget how to say that last one, but it's an Aztec city. It's in Mexico. I don't want to butcher it, so I'm not even going to try. Okay, so there's like these focal points for all of these different aspects of life. Okay. Medieval cities, which comes after ancient cities but before the modern eras, was structured a little bit differently. So basically, there's this big castle called a manor, and there's a feudal lord for that house. It's sort of like a plantation system if we think of like southern plantations today, minus the slavery. So lords were given charter rights. So the lord was like the head of the manor. And then the residents would provide either military service or sometimes agricultural, more often actually agricultural services to live on that land. So it was like, it's almost like they were paying rent, but they were paying rent via services instead of like money. They still had a city center where they would exchange goods, but there were like these smaller political systems on each manor, rather than having that all within the city. So that would be like, if you get asked about the differences between like an ancient city and a medieval cities, like the power structure was much more broken up because of all the different manors, whereas ancient cities, everything was in the city. Does that make sense? Hopefully. You can ask me more about it in class. Okay. So there's 5 urban hearths that you should memorize and know where they are on the map. Okay. Mesopotamia is the land between 2 rivers, and those 2 rivers are the Euphrates and the Tigris in modern day Iraq. So I think in your notes, if you just put like modern day Iraq, you'd be pretty close. So that was the first city. The next one is the Nile River Valley. So that's in Egypt. So you can get that on your map. The Indus River Valley. Okay. The Yellow River, sometimes it's called the Yangtze Valleys. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not telling you where these are. That's in China. Sorry. And Mesoamerica, so that would be where the Aztecs were in Mexico. And sometimes Peru is said to be the 6th urban hearth, like, so that would be Machu Picchu, probably is what they're talking about in Peru. Okay, great. All right, so Central Business District. This is basically the center of the city. It's where your tall buildings are going to be. They're financially, politically important places. So very much like those ancient cities that we talked about, a lot of our cities look like that, right? Like we have like definitely a center where all of that stuff is kind of focused and concentrated. So lots of retail and office activities, okay? There's activities that belong in the CBD and there are activities that are usually not in the CBD. But we'll talk about in a second. They're compact, meaning they're not very large areas. Especially when you go to big cities, you'll notice that they are built up, right, rather than built out. They're easily accessible. There's often freeways and lots of public transit opportunities that go right into the CBD. High land prices, so building space in a CBD is going to be more expensive typically than building space that's outside of the CBD because it's competitive, right? Like there's multiple people who would be interested in that space, so of course the person who owns that space is going to sell it to the highest bidder, so that drives prices up. That's the bid rent model that we're going to talk about in class. It's going to go in your map journal in a little bit. Let's see, and lots of intensive land use, okay, heavy use of the land. So these look different. So CBDs in North America look different than CBDs in European cities. So North America, skyscrapers, right? Chicago, San Francisco. I was just there this weekend. New York City, like all of these big cities have these really tall buildings because they built up, right? Not many people live downtown in North American CBDs. They're often for like financial services and offices and retail and things like that. Not a lot of residents typically in CBDs in North American cities because it's so expensive usually. Not a lot of parks and supermarkets in North American CBDs. I think New York City would be kind of a alternative to that because they do have parks and stuff like that. More cars in North American cities because they are newer than European cities which means that the car was invented, so the streets were built with cars in mind, whereas in European cities, those cities are so old, cars were not around, so those streets were not built with cars in mind. And low rent in the CBD. Okay, for businesses, I would say like low rent for businesses, not necessarily for residents. Okay, and then European cities tend to stay away from the skyscrapers. More people live downtown than in North American CBDs. Older structures, when we were looking at site and situation, like in Paris, we talked about how there's buildings that have been there for centuries, right? So the cities, European cities, are much older, and you can tell by the architecture. Especially Paris, lots of attention on open spaces, so it's not clustered as much as North American cities with buildings, right? There's a lot more open spaces and parks and things like that in European cities. Not as many cars because the streets can't handle it. They're very narrow streets and very high rent in the CBDs in European cities. Okay? All right. Here's some things that don't go in the CBD. Manufacturing. So all of your factories and things like that, those are not in the CBD typically. They're outside of the CBD, largely because there's no space, right? Manufacturing plants take up a lot of space, and there's just not enough room in the CBD. And this is true for North American CBDs. Residential areas are not typically in the CBD. Like, you might get a couple apartment buildings here and there, but for the most part, no, people tend to live outside of the CBD. So they might still live in a pretty urbanized area, but it won't be the central business district, okay? Okay, so just, I think it gets a little confusing. The CBD is not the city itself. It's the center of the city. So there's still city around it. But like most big, especially North American cities, have like a very focused CBD. Okay, I think that might be it. Oh, nope. All right, so what does go in a CBD? Retail services, high range retail services, meaning like your designer stores and things like that. Services for office workers, a lot of office buildings in the CBD. Financial services, legal services. It's more efficient because these are a lot of times essentially agglomerations as well, right? So that makes them more efficient. Also your public services, like for government, your city halls, your city courthouses, those things are going to typically be in the CBD. Okie doke. Now I think that's it. Yes, it is. Okay, great. So I will probably record another one just about now for Chapter 13, Key Issue 2. Expect a pop quiz. I'm recording these on spring break, but that doesn't mean that you guys are watching them on spring break, but of course expect a pop quiz. Alrighty, bye-bye. Hold on a second, I gotta get out of here. Okay.